There are wolves, and then there are Starks. And sometimes, when the gods are feeling particularly cruel to the rest of Westeros, they send a Stark who embodies everything the North has ever been, hard as frozen iron, just as winter itself, and utterly unwilling to bend. Cregan Stark was that kind of man. But he wasn't born that way. No one is. The North makes you what you are, one cold breath at a time. Cregan Stark was born in the year 108 after Aegon's conquest, in the ancient stone halls of Winterfell. The castle had stood for thousands of years, its walls built by Brandon the Builder himself, or so the stories claimed. Whether those stories were true hardly mattered. What mattered was that every stone, every dark corridor, every gust of wind that howled through the godswood carried the weight of all those centuries. You didn't just live in Winterfell. Winterfell lived in you. His father was Rickon Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Rickon was a hard man, as northern lords had to be. The North wasn't like the soft green hills of the Reach or the warm, rich lands of the Westerlands. Winter came to the North first, stayed longest, and bit deepest. A weak lord meant dead small folk. Dead small folk meant empty holdfasts. Empty holdfasts meant a broken realm. So northern lords learned to be hard, or they didn't last long enough to matter. Cregan learned this lesson early. He was the eldest son, the heir, and from the moment he could walk, he was being prepared for the weight of the North. Not prepared gently, mind you. The North had no patience for gentle lessons. When Cregan was 6 years old, his father took him into the crypts beneath Winterfell. Down they went, past generations of dead Starks, each stone face staring out from the darkness with a direwolf at its feet and an iron sword across its lap. The torches cast long shadows on the walls. The air was cold enough to see your breath, even though the hot springs beneath the castle kept the upper halls warm. Rickon stopped before the statue of a long-dead king, one of the old kings of winter, who had ruled before Aegon's dragons came and turned kings into lords. "Do you know what this is?" Rickon asked his son. Cregan looked up at the stone face. "A statue, father." "It's a reminder," Rickon said. "Every man down here was Lord of Winterfell. Every man down here thought he'd solved the problems of his time. Every man down here is dead, and the North is still here, still cold, still hard, still demanding everything from whoever sits in the high seat." He looked down at his son. "One day, that will be you. And when you're down here in the stone and silent, the only thing that will matter is whether you kept the North alive." It wasn't the kind of lesson a father in King's Landing might teach his son. There were no songs about glory, no promises of gold and honour, just stone and cold and duty. That was the northern way. Cregan grew up quickly after that. He had to. His mother, Gillian Glover, died when he was still young, struck down by a winter fever that even the hot springs and thick furs couldn't fight. Death was a frequent visitor in the North, as common as snow. You learned not to let it break you, or you broke and became useless. Cregan learned. He wept for his mother in private, as was proper, and then he went back to his lessons. Those lessons were many and varied. How to swing a sword without exhausting yourself after 10 minutes in heavy snow. How to judge a man's character by the way he looked at you when food was scarce. How to read the ravens that came from the holdfasts and villages scattered across the vast expanse of the North, each one carrying news of raiding wildlings, harsh winters, disputes between houses, requests for justice. The North was the largest region in all of Westeros, stretching from the neck to the wall, and it was the Lord of Winterfell's responsibility to hold it all together. Cregan also learned the old ways. The Starks kept the old gods, as the first men had before the Andals came with their 7. Every day Cregan would go to the godswood, to the ancient heart tree with its bone-white bark and blood-red leaves. The face carved into the trunk seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. Some men found the godswood unsettling. Cregan found it clarifying. The old gods didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They didn't pretend the world was anything other than what it was, brutal, cold, and indifferent to your hopes. You prayed to them not for salvation, but for strength, for the courage to do what had to be done, even when it cost you everything. When Cregan was 16 years old, his father died, not in battle, not heroically, but from a hunting accident. A boar, cornered and desperate, charged. Rickon took the beast down, but not before it opened his leg from knee to hip. The wound festered. Even the master's skills couldn't stop the rot. Within a week, Rickon Stark was dead, and Cregan became Lord of Winterfell. 16 was young to inherit such power. In the south, there might have been a regency, a council of older men to guide the young lord until he came of age. But this was the north, and the north had no patience for that kind of softness. If you were lord, you were lord. If you couldn't handle it, someone else would, and your line would be forgotten. The bannermen came to Winterfell for Rickon's funeral and to swear their oaths to the new Lord Stark. They came from all across the north. Umbers from Last Hearth, Karstarks from Carhold, Manderlys from White Harbour, Reeds from Greywater Watch, Mormonts from Bear Island, Glovers, Flints, Risewells, Dustins, and more. Each one knelt before the young Wolf Lord and spoke the words their fathers and grandfathers had spoken. I swear my loyalty to House Stark. I swear to answer your call when winter comes. But words were easy. Respect had to be earned. Some of the older lords looked at Cregan and saw a boy. They saw an opportunity, perhaps, to gain more independence, to push back against Winterfell's authority while the Lord was still finding his footing. That was a mistake. Lord Serwyn, an older man who had served Rickon faithfully, decided to test the new lord's resolve. He came to Cregan with a dispute involving his lands and those of House Tallheart. It was a minor matter, the kind that could be resolved with a simple judgment. But Serwyn made it clear he expected the judgment to favour him, as a reward for his years of loyal service. Cregan listened to both sides. He reviewed the old maps and charters. He consulted with his Maester, and then he ruled in favour of House Tallheart, because that was where the law and justice pointed. When Serwyn protested, Cregan's response was cold and final. My father earned your loyalty, Cregan said. I haven't. Not yet. But I'll earn it the same way he did, by being just, even when it costs me, especially when it costs me. You may leave, Lord Serwyn. And when you return to your hall, remember that the boy you thought you saw is Lord of Winterfell, and Lord of Winterfell does not rule by favour. He rules by duty. Word of that exchange spread quickly. The northern lords learned that Cregan Stark might be young, but he was no one's puppet. He was his father's son, and more. There was an edge to him, a cold certainty that even Rickon hadn't possessed. When Cregan gave an order, it was followed. When he made a judgment, it stood. And when he looked at you with those grey, stark eyes, you felt the weight of 8,000 years of history pressing down on your shoulders. But ruling wasn't just about making hard decisions in the Great Hall. It was about understanding your people, your land, your place in the great terrible machinery of power that ground across Westeros like a millstone. Cregan understood that the North was different from the rest of the realm. The North was older. It had been a kingdom unto itself for thousands of years before Torrhen Stark bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. The memory of that independence lingered. Northern lords paid their taxes to the Iron Throne, sent men south when called, but they did so with the understanding that the North took care of its own first. This was the philosophy Cregan inherited and sharpened like a blade. The North was not the South's servant. The North was a partner, one that demanded respect. And if that respect wasn't given freely, it would be taken by force. But force was expensive. Blood had a cost that gold couldn't pay. So Cregan learned to be patient, to wait, to let the South exhaust itself with its games and ambitions, while the North remained strong, cold, and ready. He spent his early years as Lord doing exactly that. He travelled across his domain, visiting holdfasts and villages that hadn't seen a Lord of Winterfell in years. He listened to the small folk, heard their grievances, settled their disputes. He hunted with his bannermen, broke bread in their halls, and married a Blackwood girl named Ara to strengthen ties with the Riverlands. She was fierce and quick-witted, a match for him in will, if not in physical strength. She gave him a son, and for a brief moment Cregan allowed himself to believe that perhaps the gods had granted him something more than duty and cold stone. But the gods, whether old or new, are not generous. Ara died in childbirth not long after, taking the child with her. Cregan buried them both, added 2 more names to the list of people the North had taken from him, and went back to work. There was no time for grief. Winter was coming. It was always coming. By the time Cregan reached his early 20s, he had transformed Winterfell and the North into something formidable. His bannermen respected him. His small folk trusted him. His enemies, few though they were, feared him. He had proven himself in small ways and large, putting down a wildling raid near the Gift, resolving a succession crisis in House Hornwood, personally leading a hunt for bandits who had been terrorizing the villages near the Barrowlands. He was exactly the kind of lord the North needed. Strong, just, patient, and utterly unwilling to compromise on matters of honor and duty. The kind of man who would do what needed to be done, no matter the cost to himself. The kind of man who could look at a hard choice and not flinch. And then, in the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, ravens began arriving at Winterfell with news from the south. Dark news. Terrible news. News of dragons fighting dragons, of a kingdom tearing itself apart, of old King Viserys dead and his children at war over the Iron Throne. The dance of the dragons had begun. Cregan Stark read those ravens in his solar, in the cold grey light of a northern morning, and he knew that everything was about to change. The south was going to bleed itself dry. Houses would fall. Dragons would die. And when it was all over, someone would have to pick up the pieces and remind the survivors what justice actually looked like. He didn't know it yet, but that someone would be him. The Wolf of the North, the Lord who would march south and terrify a broken realm into remembering that some men couldn't be bought, could not be swayed, and could not be stopped. But that was still to come. For now, Cregan Stark stood at his window, looking out over the snow-covered yards of Winterfell, and wondered what role the North would play in the war that was coming. He had been hardened by loss, tempered by duty, and shaped by the unforgiving land he ruled. he was ready. The South wasn't. But while the young Wolf Lord sharpened his claws in the frozen north, dragons were about to tear the realm in half, and blood would flow south of the neck like rivers after a spring thaw. The dance of the dragons was beginning, and before it ended, every house in Westeros would learn what it meant to face a Stark who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he was willing to do. The ravens came to Winterfell like black omens, one after another, each bearing news worse than the last. King Viserys I was dead. His daughter Rhaenyra claimed the throne as his chosen heir. His son Aegon had been crowned in King's Landing by his mother, Queen Alicent, and her father, Otto Hightower. The realm, which had known nearly a century of peace under Targaryen rule, was splitting in two, and splitting violently. Cregan Stark read each raven carefully, methodically, the way he did everything. He stood in his solar, the room warmed by the hot springs that ran beneath Winterfell's ancient stones, but feeling colder with each word he absorbed. This wasn't some minor succession dispute that could be resolved with negotiation and compromise. This was war. Dragon against dragon. Targaryen against Targaryen. The kind of war that would set the realm on fire. The Maesters had a name for dragons fighting each other, though it wasn't used in polite company. Fratricide, kinslaying. The worst sin a man could commit, according to gods old and new. But apparently, dragons were exempt from such concerns. Or perhaps the Targaryens simply believed they were above the laws that governed normal men. Cregan's master, a young man named Kennet, who had come from the Citadel only 2 years prior, stood nearby with a stack of correspondence. "My lord," he said carefully, "both sides will be seeking allies. The North's strength could tip the balance." "The North's strength," Cregan repeated, his voice flat. He looked out the window at the training yard below, where his men were practicing with swords and spears in the cold morning air. "Tell me, Maester Kennet, how many dragons does the North have?" "None, my lord." "And how many do the Targaryens have?" Kennet shifted uncomfortably. "Both sides possess several, my lord. The Blacks, that is Princess Rhaenyra's faction, control Dragonstone and have a larger number. The Greens, King Aegon's supporters, hold King's Landing and the Royal Dragons. So we have none, and they have more than enough to burn the North to ash if we make the wrong choice." Cregan turned from the window. "That's what you're telling me." "The strategic situation is complex, my lord." "The strategic situation is simple," Cregan said. 2 Targaryens want the same crown, and they're willing to destroy the realm to get it. And we're expected to pick a side and bleed for their ambition. He wasn't wrong. The letters had already started arriving. Carefully worded appeals from both factions. The Greens wrote of legitimacy, of the natural order, of a son's right to inherit over a daughter. They spoke of tradition and the will of the realm. The Blacks wrote of King Viserys' chosen successor, of oaths sworn years ago by every great lord in Westeros, of honour and keeping one's word. Both sides made compelling arguments. Both sides were probably lying about something. That was the nature of Southern politics. Beautiful words wrapped around ugly truths. Cregan's bannermen had their own opinions, of course. Lord Manderley of White Harbour, whose house had southern roots and southern ambitions, favoured the Blacks. He spoke of the oaths their fathers had sworn to Rhaenyra when she was named heir. Lord Umber of Last Hearth, a blunt man who cared more for fighting than politics, simply wanted to know which side would give them the best chance for glory and plunder. The other lords fell somewhere in between, each with their own reasons, their own ambitions, their own fears. But it was Cregan's decision to make. That was the burden of being Lord of Winterfell. Everyone else could argue and debate and voice their opinions, but in the end, the choice and the consequences would be his alone. He made them wait. For weeks, as the South descended into chaos, as both sides consolidated their power and prepared for war, Cregan Stark said nothing. He sent no ravens pledging support. He called no banners. He simply watched and waited, gathering information, weighing options, considering consequences. This drove some of his bannermen to distraction. They wanted action, decision, movement. The North was not accustomed to hesitation. But Cregan understood something they didn't. The dance had just begun. Both sides were strong, both sides were confident, and both sides believed they would win quickly and decisively. This was the worst possible time to commit. Let them exhaust themselves first. Let them bleed. Let them realize that victory wouldn't come cheap or easy. Then, when they were desperate and weakened, the North's support would be worth far more. It was the kind of cold calculation that would have made a Southern lord proud. But Cregan wasn't doing it for political advantage. He was doing it because he had no intention of sending Northern men south to die for nothing. If the North was going to bleed, it would be for something worth the cost. The waiting ended when a dragon landed in the yard of Winterfell. It was a cold afternoon in late autumn when the sentries began shouting. Cregan was in the Great Hall, settling a dispute between two minor lords over fishing rights in the White Knife, when the doors burst open and one of his guards ran in, breathless and wide-eyed. "My lord," the man gasped, "a dragon in the yard!" The hall went silent. Every man there had heard of dragons, of course. They featured in songs and stories, in the history of how Aegon the Conqueror had forged the Seven Kingdoms with fire and blood. But none of them had ever seen one. Dragons didn't come north. The north was too cold, too far from the warm volcanic hills of Dragonstone where dragons thrived. A dragon in Winterfell was unprecedented. Cregan rose from his seat. "How large?" "Large, my lord. Green and bronze. It's just sitting there. And there's a rider, a young man. He's asking to speak with you." Cregan descended from the high seat and walked toward the doors. His bannermen followed, hands on sword hilts, uncertain and uneasy. They emerged into the yard to find exactly what the guard had described. A dragon, easily 40 feet long, coiled in the center of the training ground. Its scales gleamed like polished metal in the weak northern sun. Its eyes, golden and slitted like a cat's, watched the assembled Northmen with what might have been amusement or hunger. It was impossible to tell with dragons. Standing beside the beast, looking remarkably calm for someone surrounded by dozens of armed and nervous warriors, was a young man. He couldn't have been more than 16, with dark hair and the distinctive Valyrian features of House Targaryen, though his face was broader, stronger, less refined than the typical dragon lord. He wore flying leathers and a sword at his hip, and he stood with the easy confidence of someone who knew the dragon behind him, made him untouchable. "Lord Cregan Stark," the young man called out, "I am Jacaerys Valerian, son of Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen and heir to the Iron Throne. I have come to treat you on behalf of my mother, the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms." Cregan approached slowly, carefully, keeping his movements non-threatening. The dragon tracked him with those golden eyes, but didn't move. Up close, the creature was even more impressive and terrifying. He could feel the heat radiating from its scales, could smell something acrid and sulphurous in the air around it. This was a living weapon, a piece of the old Valyrian Empire made flesh and fire. "Prince Jacaerys," Cregan said, his voice carrying across the yard, "Winterfell welcomes you. Though I confess we are not accustomed to receiving guests who arrive on dragonback." Jacaerys smiled. It was a good smile, open and genuine, without the smirking superiority some Targaryens wore like a crown. "Vermax is perfectly behaved, my lord. He won't harm anyone unless I command it." "Comforting," Cregan said dryly. He gestured toward the great hall. "Come, we'll speak inside, where it's warm and there are fewer things that can accidentally catch fire." The prince laughed at that, which earned him a measure of respect from the watching Northmen. A man who could laugh at himself, who didn't take offense at every jest, was worth talking to. Cregan led him inside, while his men remained in the yard, keeping a wary eye on the dragon. In the sun, away from prying ears, Cregan poured 2 cups of mulled wine and offered one to his guest. Jacaerys accepted it gratefully, warming his hands on the cup. "The cold here is different from Dragonstone," he said. "It goes deeper, into your bones." "The North is not kind to those unprepared for it," Cregan agreed. "But you didn't fly all this way to discuss the weather, Prince Jacaerys. What does your mother want from the North?" Jacaerys set down his cup and met Cregan's gaze directly. "She wants what was promised, what your father swore, along with every other lord in the realm. When Rhaenyra was named heir, when King Viserys presented her to the realm and commanded that oaths be sworn, your father was there. He bent the knee. He pledged House Stark's support." "My father is dead," Cregan said quietly. "I am Lord of Winterfell now, and while I honour his oaths, I must also consider what is best for the North." "What's best for the North is honouring your sworn word," Jacaerys said, and there was steel beneath the courtesy now. "The Greens have usurped the throne. They've broken every law and custom of succession. They've spat on King Viserys' wishes and crowned a drunkard in my mother's place. If you stand aside and let this happen, what does that say about northern honour?" It was a good argument, a sharp argument, the kind that would appeal to a certain type of lord. But Cregan had been raised in a harder school than that. It says that the North doesn't spend its strength on southern quarrels unless there's reason to, Cregan replied. "Your mother's claim is legitimate. I don't dispute that. But legitimate claims don't win wars. Dragons and armies do. And from where I sit, both sides have dragons, both sides have armies, and this war is going to be long and bloody regardless of what the North does." "Then help us end it quickly," Jacaerys pressed. "The North's army is the largest in the realm. If you march south with 20,000 men..." "The North's army is also the slowest to raise and the hardest to maintain," Cregan interrupted. "Do you know how long it takes to gather men from Last Hearth, from Bear Island? Do you understand the logistics of marching that many soldiers south through the neck in winter? We would arrive months after being called, and by then the war might already be decided." Jacaerys studied him carefully. "You're not refusing, you're negotiating." Cregan allowed himself a small smile. The prince was smarter than he looked. "I'm considering. There's a difference." "Then consider this," Jacaerys said. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "My mother will win this war, Lord Stark. She has more dragons, more allies, and the law on her side. But she will remember who stood with her from the beginning and who waited to see which way the wind blew. The North is proud of its honor. Prove it." They talked for hours. Jacaerys laid out his mother's position, her allies in the Riverlands, the Vale, the support of House Velaryon with its powerful fleet, the dragons at her command. He spoke of his younger brothers, Lucerys and Joffrey, of his dragon-riding uncles Daemon and his sons. He painted a picture of inevitable victory, of the Greens as a doomed faction clinging to power they had no right to hold. Cregan listened to all of it, and then he made his terms. "The North will support Queen Rhaenyra," he said finally. "But understand this, Prince Jacaerys, we do not do this lightly. The North remembers every promise made, and we expect every promise to be kept." "Name your price," Jacaerys said immediately. "Not a price, a pact." Cregan stood and walked to the window, looking out over his domain. "The North has been part of the Seven Kingdoms for over a century, but we remain separate in many ways. We keep the old gods. We maintain our own customs. We expect that to continue. More than that, we expect the Crown to remember that the North's loyalty must be earned, not demanded." "My mother understands that," Jacaerys said carefully. "Does she?" Cregan turned back. "Then she'll agree to a marriage alliance, a formal one, bound in law and custom. When this war is over, when your mother sits the Iron Throne as she should, there will be a marriage between our houses. That bond will ensure that the North and the Crown remain united not through fear or force, but through blood and honor." It was a bold demand. Marriage alliances between ruling houses were powerful things, not granted lightly. But Jacaerys didn't hesitate. "Done. I'll carry your terms to my mother personally. She'll agree." "Then we have a pact," Cregan said. He extended his hand, and Jacaerys took it. "The pact of ice and fire. Let it be remembered that House Stark keeps its oaths and expects the same in return." They sealed the agreement with more than just words. Scribes were summoned, documents were drawn up, seals were affixed. By the time Jacaerys climbed back onto his dragon and flew south, the North was committed. Cregan had chosen his side, but he had done so on his terms, and with a clear understanding of what that commitment meant. The North would support Rhaenyra, but the North would not rush blindly into battle. He would take his time raising his host. He would wait until winter broke and the roads were clear. He would prepare his men properly, equip them thoroughly, and then, only then, would he march south. By that time, the dance would have already consumed dozens of lords and several dragons. By that time, both sides would be weakened and desperate. And when the armies of the North finally arrived, they would arrive as a decisive force, not as one more desperate faction throwing itself into the meat grinder. His bannermen gathered in the great hall that evening, and Cregan told them what had been decided. Some cheered, eager for war and glory. Others looked grim, understanding the cost that was coming. All of them accepted his decision, because that was the Northern way. The Lord of Winterfell had spoken, and his word was law. "We will prepare," Cregan told them, his voice carrying through the hall. "We will gather our strength. We will train our men. And when the time is right, when we can make the greatest difference, we will march south and remind the realm what Northern justice looks like." They raised their cups and drank to that, to war, to honor, to the North. But Cregan didn't drink. He looked at the faces of his bannermen, these men who would follow him south into fire and blood, and he felt the weight of what he had just done. He had committed the North to war. Men would die, houses would fall, widows would weep, and orphans would curse his name. But it was the right choice, the only choice. Because if the North was going to bend the knee to the Iron Throne, it would be to a monarch who had earned that loyalty, not one who had stolen it. And if the realm needed to be reminded that some things, honor, justice, sworn oaths, actually mattered, then the North would be the one to do the reminding, even if it meant marching through blood to do it. The ravens went out the next morning, carrying word across the North. Call the banners, gather the men, prepare for a war. The dance of the dragons had claimed the North as one of its players, and Cregan Stark had made his choice. But the North moves at its own pace, on its own terms, and the South would have to bleed a while longer before the wolves came south to settle accounts and remind everyone what happened when you forgot that winter always, always comes. The ravens went out, but the armies did not follow. Not immediately. Not with the reckless haste that southern lords might have shown. This was the North, and the North had learned patience over 8,000 years of survival in the harshest land in Westeros. Cregan Stark would not waste that wisdom for the sake of appearing eager. In the great hall of Winterfell, a map of Westeros lay spread across a heavy oak table. Cregan stood over it, his grey eyes tracing the distances, calculating the variables. From Winterfell to King's Landing was nearly 2,000 miles. Through the Neck, that treacherous stretch of swamp and bog that separated the North from the rest of the realm, then down the King's Road through the Riverlands, past the Trident, through the lands that were even now being torn apart by war. "My lord," Lord Manderley said, his considerable bulk leaning over the table beside Cregan. "Our men are gathering, but slowly. The mountain clans won't arrive for another month. The men from Bear Island and Skargos even longer." "Good," Cregan said simply. Manderley blinked. "Good, my lord?" "The longer we take, the more desperate they become. The more desperate they become, the more our support is worth." Cregan tapped the map, where King's Landing sat at the mouth of the Blackwater. "By the time we arrive, they'll be grateful to see us." It wasn't cruelty that drove this strategy. It was clear-eyed pragmatism. The Dance of the Dragons was not the North's war. It was a Targaryen civil war, a fight over which silver-haired dragon rider got to sit on a throne made of conquered swords. The North had no stake in that question beyond the oaths that bound them. But oaths, Cregan understood, were not suicide pacts. Supporting Rhaenyra did not mean throwing northern lives away in a futile rush to battle. So while the South burned, Cregan built. He fortified. He trained. He turned the slow gathering of the northern host into an exercise in preparation that would serve them well when battle finally came. The training yards of Winterfell became brutal classrooms where men learned to fight not for glory, but for survival. Cregan himself led many of the drills, his sword, Ice, the ancient Valyrian steel greatsword of House Stark, moving through practice forms with deadly precision. The weapon was taller than many men, its blade rippling with the distinctive patterns of true Valyrian steel, grey as smoke and deadly as winter. "Again," Cregan commanded, watching a group of younger soldiers practice shield walls. "You break formation like that in battle, and you die. And worse, the man beside you dies because you failed him." The soldiers reformed, locked their shields, and tried again. Cregan walked among them, correcting stances, adjusting grips, his voice never rising, but somehow cutting through every other sound in the yard. This was not the romantic vision of warfare that singers celebrated. This was the reality. Tired men in heavy armor, learning to hold formation when every instinct screamed to run, to break, to save yourself. The South fights for glory, Cregan told his captains one evening as snow began to fall outside. They want songs sung about them. They want their names remembered. We fight because someone has to, because the job needs doing. Teach the men that. Make them understand that survival, their brother's survival, matters more than valor. It was a philosophy born of northern winters, where heroic gestures got you killed and practical caution kept your family alive. And it would serve them well in the war to come. The ravens arrived almost daily, bearing news from the south. Each message painted a picture more grim than the last. The war was spreading like plague, consuming everything it touched. Battle of the burning mill. Riverlands torn apart as brackens and blackwood slaughtered each other. Battle above the god's eye. Dragons fighting dragons. A sight so terrible that those who witnessed it said the sky itself had caught fire. Prince Lucerys Velaryon, Jacaerys' younger brother, killed by his uncle Aemond. Prince Jaehaerys, King Aegon's heir, murdered in his bed by assassins in an act of revenge so monstrous it shocked even hardened warriors. Blood and gold, fire and betrayal. The dance was consuming lords and small folk alike, grinding them beneath its wheels with savage indifference. Cregan read each report carefully, marking changes on his map. Houses declaring for one side or the other. Battles won and lost. Dragons dead. Arrax, melees, others. Each dragon that fell changed the strategic calculus. Each great house that committed fully narrowed the range of outcomes. His bannermen grew restless. They saw the news from the south and wanted to march immediately, to claim their share of glory before the war ended. Lord Umber was particularly vocal about it. While we sit here playing with soldiers, real battles are being fought, Umber growled during one war council. The Riverlands are drowning in blood. Our allies need us now, not 6 months from now. Our allies need us when we can be decisive, Cregan replied calmly. Not when we'll simply be one more army getting chewed up in someone else's war. We march when winter breaks. Not before. The men will think us cowards, another lord muttered. Cregan's gaze snapped to him, cold and hard. The men will think what I tell them to think, and I will tell them that we fight smart, not fast, that we preserve our strength until it can be used properly, that the North doesn't waste lives for the sake of appearing brave. He stood, his presence dominating the room. Any man who questions that is welcome to ride south on his own. I will not stop him, but he will not take northern soldiers with him. No one took him up on the offer. Cregan's authority was absolute, built on a foundation of just rule and demonstrated competence. His bannermen might grumble, but they would obey. The waiting also served another purpose. It gave Cregan time to understand what kind of war this truly was. The dance wasn't simply a succession dispute that could be resolved by putting one claimant on the throne. It had metastasized into something darker. Blood debts were being tallied. Ancient grievances were being settled. Houses were choosing sides not based on law or legitimacy, but on opportunities for revenge, for advancement, for settling old scores. This was the kind of war that didn't end cleanly. This was the kind of war that poisoned the soil, that left wounds festering for generations. And that meant that whoever ended up on the Iron Throne would need help rebuilding, would need strong allies who hadn't been exhausted by years of fighting, would need someone to remind the realm what justice looked like when it wasn't being administered by whichever side won the latest battle. That was the role Cregan was preparing for. Not as a conqueror, not as a kingmaker, but as the man who would arrive when everyone else was too tired to fight anymore and say, enough. This ends now. And this is how it ends, with justice, with honor, with the old laws enforced regardless of who finds them inconvenient. It was an audacious vision, perhaps even an arrogant one. But Cregan had been raised to believe that the North, cold, hard, unbending, represented something essential that the South too often forgot. The North remembered. The North kept faith. And when necessary, the North would be the conscience of a realm that had lost its way. Meanwhile, the army continued to gather. From every corner of the North they came, grizzled veterans and green boys, knights on destriers, and men with nothing but a spear and leather jerkin, the proud and the desperate, all flowing toward Winterfell like rivers toward the sea. The yards and fields around the castle became a vast camp, thousands of men living in tents, training, eating, waiting. Cregan walked among them often, learning their names when he could, listening to their concerns. He knew that many of them would not come back. That was the nature of war. But he wanted them to know that their Lord saw them, valued them, and would not throw their lives away carelessly. "Why are we waiting, my lord?" a young soldier asked him one day. The boy couldn't have been more than 15, all gangly limbs and nervous energy. "Because the South is learning a lesson," Cregan replied, "and lessons learned in blood stick better than lessons learned in songs. When we march south, every lord and knight will know what northern men can do, and they'll know that we chose our moment carefully, that we're not some reckless rabble looking for glory." "Will there be glory, my lord?" the boy asked. Cregan looked at him for a long moment. "There will be hard fighting. There will be fear and blood and moments where you want to run. There will be brothers in arms who die beside you. And when it's over, if you survive, there will be the knowledge that you did your duty." He paused. "If that's glory to you, then yes, there will be glory." The boy thought about this, then nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer he'd wanted, perhaps, but it was an honest one, and soldiers, real soldiers, valued honesty over pretty lies. Winter did eventually break, as it always did. The snow has receded, the roads became passable, and the army of the North, 20,000 strong, finally prepared to march. It had taken months, far longer than any southern army would have needed. But the force that assembled outside Winterfell's walls was unlike any southern host. These were men who had been trained not just to fight, but to endure. Who understood that war was not a sprint, but a terrible marathon. Who followed a lord they trusted completely, because he had proven over and over that he valued their lives and would not waste them. The night before the march, Cregan stood in the godswood before the heart tree. The face carved into the white bark seemed to watch him with ancient, knowing eyes. He knelt in the dirt and spoke his prayer silently, as was proper. He asked not for victory. The gods didn't grant victories to those who prayed the loudest. He asked for wisdom, for strength, for the courage to do what was right, even when it cost him everything. The old gods gave no answer. They never did. But Cregan rose from his knees feeling steadier, more certain. The decision had been made. The die had been cast. Now there was only the march and whatever waited at the end of it. The next morning the army moved. Not quickly, not with the desperate haste of men rushing toward glory, but with the inexorable certainty of winter coming south. The column stretched for miles. Soldiers, supplies, camp followers, all moving in disciplined order down the King's Road. Cregan rode at the head with his bannerman, ice strapped across his back, his grey eyes fixed on the southern horizon. Behind him came the strength of the North, every house represented, every man carrying the knowledge that they marched for something more than personal ambition. They marched because their Lord had given his word. And in the North, a Lord's word mattered. The march would take weeks. By the time they reached King's Landing, the war would look very different from how it had when they left. Dragons would have died. Battles would have been won and lost. The political landscape would have shifted in ways impossible to predict. But Cregan knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the North finally arrived, exhausted and travel-worn, but undefeated and unbowed, the entire realm would be forced to reckon with what it meant when winter came south. And the lords and ladies who had spent years playing their games, making their plots, pursuing their ambitions, they would learn what every northerner already knew. Winter doesn't negotiate. Winter doesn't compromise. Winter doesn't care about your excuses or your justifications. Winter simply comes. And when it does, you either survive it with honor, or you don't survive it at all. The Dance of the Dragons was about to meet the Wolf of Winterfell, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The North moved like a glacier, slow, inevitable, crushing everything in its path. 20,000 men marching south through a realm that had been at war for over a year was not a simple military maneuver. It was a migration, a statement, a promise of reckoning carried on 10,000 pairs of boots. Cregan Stark rode at the vanguard, his greatsword eye strapped across his back, his grey cloak billowing in the wind. Around him rode the lords of the North, Manderley, Umber, Karstark, Glover, Dustin, Ryswell, and more. Each man commanded his own contingent, each house contributing what it could. Together, they represented the largest uncommitted military force left in Westeros. The march through the North itself was uneventful. They followed the King's Road, that ancient track that ran from the Wall to King's Landing, built by Brandon the Builder or some other long-dead Stark, depending on which story you believed. The small folk came out to watch them pass, standing by the roadside in silence. Some brought food, hard bread, dried meat, what little they could spare. Others simply stared, understanding that their sons and brothers were marching towards something terrible. Cregan made sure the army didn't take more than was freely offered. Discipline was maintained with iron strictness. Any man caught stealing or abusing the small folk was flogged publicly. 2 soldiers who raped a farmer's daughter were hanged from a tree beside the road, their bodies left as a reminder that northern justice applied to everyone, high-born and low. "The realm will judge us by our conduct," Cregan told his officers after the hanging. "We are not raiders. We are not a mob. We are the army of the North, and we will behave accordingly." It was a harsh standard, but it worked. The army moved through the North, leaving minimal destruction in its wake, a feat almost unheard of in wartime. And word of that discipline travelled faster than the army itself. carried by small folk and merchants, spreading the news that Lord Stark's host was different from the rapacious forces that had been ravaging the Riverlands for months. The real test came at the Neck. That treacherous stretch of swamp and causeway had broken more than one southern army. The ground turned to mud beneath your feet. The paths disappeared into standing water. Disease flourished in the wet heat, despite the season. Men could march into the Neck and simply vanish, swallowed by bogs, or picked off by cranomen who knew every hidden path and secret waterway. But the North knew the Neck. The reeds of Greywater Watch, the crannogmen who called that inhospitable land home, served House Stark with unwavering loyalty. They guided Cregan's army through, showing them the safe paths, warning them away from the deadly ones. It still took weeks to traverse, weeks of wet misery and biting insects, and the constant fear of losing your footing and disappearing into black water. But they made it through with losses that were surprisingly light. A few dozen men to disease and accidents, but no major disasters. South of the Neck, everything changed. The Riverlands had always been the crossroads of Westeros, the fertile heartland where the great rivers met and trade flowed freely. But the Riverlands were also cursed with terrible geography for wartime, no natural barriers, no mountains or seas to protect them, just open land that every army had to cross to get anywhere. And for over a year, armies had been doing exactly that. The devastation was staggering. Fields that should have been ripe with crops were burned black. Villages stood empty. Their inhabitants fled or died. Castles that had stood for centuries were now smoke-blackened ruins. The ravens had carried news of battles, the burning mill, the fish feed, half a dozen others. But seeing the aftermath was different. The bones of thousands of men lay scattered across the countryside, picked clean by crows and wolves. Entire forests had been cut down for siege works or simply burned because fire was easier than cutting. Cregan's army marched through this wasteland in grim silence. His soldiers, even the youngest and most naive, understood what they were seeing. This was what war looked like when it was allowed to run unchecked. This was what happened when great lords pursued their ambitions without regard for the people who would suffer. They passed through holdfasts where the only living things were dogs gone feral, feeding on corpses. They found villages where every building had been stripped of anything valuable. Not just gold and silver, but tools, clothing, even the nails holding the timbers together. An army, impossible to say which one, had picked the place clean like locusts, leaving nothing behind. 7 hells, Lord Manderley breathed, as they rode through what had once been a prosperous town. Now it was a ghost, empty buildings with empty eyes. This is worse than the tales suggested. This is what we're marching to stop, Cregan said quietly. This is what happens when there's no one left to enforce justice, when the only law is the sword, and the only mercy is whatever your enemies feel like granting. They met refugees on the road, small folk fleeing north, away from the fighting, hoping to find safety in a region that wasn't actively tearing itself apart. Cregan ordered his men to share food when they could, to leave supplies at crossroads where the desperate might find them. It wasn't charity. It was a reminder that the North remembered the small folk existed, that they mattered, that someone in this damned realm still believed that lords owed their people protection, not just exploitation. The refugees brought news, and none of it was good. The dance had reached a fever pitch of slaughter. dragons were dying. Sunfire, Mealy's, Moondancer, Vermithor, names that had seemed eternal, were now just memories and scattered bones. The Blacks had taken King's Landing, then lost it, then taken it again. Rhaenyra herself had sat the Iron Throne for a brief, bloody period before being forced to flee. Prince Aegon, King Aegon to the Greens, had been horribly wounded by dragonfire and was said to be more corpse than king. And the battles continued. Tumbleton, the Butcher's Ball, the first and second battle of the King's Road, each one consuming hundreds or thousands of men, each one settling nothing. The war had become a self-sustaining horror, fed by revenge and ambition, and the simple fact that neither side could afford to stop while the other still fought. "How much further?" Lord Umber asked one evening, as they made camp near the ruins of a castle that Cregan didn't recognize. It had been burned so thoroughly that even its name was lost. 3 weeks, Cregan replied. "Maybe less if we push. But we won't push. The men need their strength." "There might not be a war left to fight if we take too long," Umber pointed out. "Then we'll have saved thousands of lives by arriving late," Cregan said flatly. "Either way, we'll do this properly." But privately, Cregan wondered if Umber was right. The news suggested the war was winding down, not because either side had won, but because both sides had exhausted themselves. Rhaenyra was dead, killed by her own brother Aegon, in a moment of savage revenge that shocked even those accustomed to the dance's brutality. Aegon himself had died shortly after, his wounds finally claiming him. The claimants were dead. The dragons, those terrible weapons that had dominated Westerosi warfare for over a century, were mostly gone. What was left? Chaos. That was what was left. A realm with no clear ruler, multiple factions all claiming legitimacy, and no one with the strength to impose order. It was into this power vacuum that the North was marching. They received word from King's Landing through riders sent north to meet them. The city was in the hands of Lord Larys, strong, and the remaining loyalists of the late King Aegon. But support was fragmentary. Half the lords who had fought for the Greens were dead or discredited. The other half were terrified of reprisals from the Blacks. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra's remaining supporters, those who hadn't fled or turned their cloaks, were scrambling to crown her young son, another Aegon, as the rightful king. No one was in control. Everyone was afraid. And in that fear, they had turned to the one force that hadn't been bled dry by the dance. They had turned to the north. The closer they got to King's Landing, the more desperate the messages became. Lords begging for Cregan's support, factions trying to win his favour, promises of gold, of land, of power. Everyone suddenly remembered that they had always admired the North, had always believed in Northern honour, and had always intended to support whatever the North supported. Cregan burned most of the letters without responding. The ones he did respond to, he kept his answers brief and cold. The North was coming. Justice would be served. That was all anyone needed to know. His officers debated strategy around campfires at night. What would they find when they reached King's Landing? Would there be fighting? Would they need to besiege the city? Would the remaining factions unite against them, seeing the North as a threat to all southern ambitions? Cregan listened to these debates but said little. He had his own thoughts, his own plans, but he kept them close. A leader who revealed everything was a leader who could be outmaneuvered. Better to arrive as an unknown quantity, a force that no one quite understood, and therefore couldn't predict. They crossed the trident at the Twins, paying the Freys the toll they demanded for passage. The Ironborn had raided the western coast during the dance, and the Freys had profited handsomely by maintaining neutrality and charging both sides for use of their bridges. Cregan paid without comment, though he marked the Freys in his mind as opportunists who would need watching. South of the Trident, the land began to change. Less devastated here, the fighting had mostly bypassed this region, but you could feel the fear in the air. Small folk watched the northern army pass with wide, terrified eyes, uncertain if these were saviors or just another army coming to take what little they had left. Cregan sent heralds ahead, proclaiming that the North came in the name of justice and Queen Rhaenyra's memory. That seemed to calm things somewhat, though the fear didn't entirely disappear. After a year of war, everyone had learned that proclamations meant nothing. Only actions mattered. Finally, after weeks of marching, after watching a broken realm pass by mile after mile, they came within sight of King's Landing. The city sprawled before them, massive and filthy and magnificent all at once. 1 million people lived within those walls, more people than existed in the entire north. The Red Keep loomed on, its hill, crowned by the sept that had been built atop Aegon's high hill. The harbour was full of ships, Valyrian vessels mostly, maintaining a blockade. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and even from a distance you could smell the city, a mixture of humanity, industry, and waste that was overwhelming to northern sensibilities. 7 hells, someone muttered. I've never seen so many people in one place. You'll see even more once we're inside, Cregan said. He was studying the walls, the gates, the disposition of whatever forces might be defending, but he didn't see any signs of immediate hostility. No armies arrayed to meet them, no dragons circling overhead, because there were no dragons left, or precious few. A delegation rode out from the city to meet them. Lords and knights in expensive armour, trying to look confident, but failing. They stopped a respectful distance from the northern host and waited for Cregan to approach. He did, taking only a small escort. Lord Manderley at his side, a few guards, and the great banner of House Stark, the grey direwolf on its ice-white field, snapping in the wind. The leader of the delegation, a lord whose name Cregan would learn was Corlys Velaryon, sea snake and lord of the tides, looked ancient and exhausted. He had been hand to both Rhaenyra and her son, had seen more death and destruction than most men could bear, and it showed in every line of his weathered face. Lord Stark, Corlys said, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his apparent age. Winterfell is far from King's Landing. We did not expect you for another month, if at all. The North keeps its promises, Cregan replied simply. We swore to support Queen Rhaenyra. The fact that she's dead doesn't release us from that oath. We're here to see her son, King Aegon III, properly secured on his throne. King Aegon is 10 years old, Corlys said carefully. Then he'll need good counsel, Cregan replied. And he'll need someone to clean up the mess this war has made. I assume that's why you're here, instead of inside your comfortable keep. To negotiate. Corlys studied him for a long moment. You're younger than I expected. And you're older, Cregan said. But neither of our ages changes what needs to be done. The realm is broken. Justice needs to be served, traitors need to be punished, and someone needs to make it clear that the dance is over, that the killing stops now, and that anyone who disagrees will answer to the North. There was steel in his voice, cold northern steel that cut through all the diplomatic niceties. Corlys heard it, and, to his credit, didn't flinch. "The city is yours, Lord Stark," Corlys said finally. "Enter as a friend. The young king will be glad of your support." "I'm not here as a friend," Cregan corrected. "I'm here as an executioner, but I'll be just one." With that, he turned his horse and rode back to his army. Behind him, he could hear the southern lords murmuring among themselves, uncertain and afraid. Good. Let them be afraid. Fear would keep them honest, at least for a while. The gates of King's Landing opened, the north marched in, and the hour of the wolf was about to begin. The northern host entered King's Landing like winter personified, silent, cold, and inexorable. 20,000 men marched through streets that had seen dragonfire and riots, past buildings still bearing scorch marks from when Queen Rhaenyra had been driven out by a starving, maddened mob. The small folk lined the streets to watch them pass, and what struck Cregan most was the silence. No cheers, no jeers, just blank-eyed observations from people who had learned that cheering for the wrong side could get you killed. The Red Keep loomed ahead, its walls stained with soot and blood, a monument to power that had changed hands 3 times in a single year. Cregan rode through the gates with his bannermen, their horses' hooves echoing on ancient stone. Servants scattered before them like mice, unused to the harsh northern faces and the cold efficiency with which these men moved. They found the court assembled in the throne room, though court was perhaps too generous a word. A handful of lords, twice as many guards, and on the Iron Throne itself, that twisted monstrosity of conquered swords, sat a boy. Aegon III was 10 years old, thin and pale, with the silver hair of House Targaryen and eyes that had seen far too much for someone so young. He had watched his mother die, had lost his brothers, had been a prisoner and a pawn for most of his short life. Now he was a king, and he looked utterly lost. Beside the throne stood Lord Corlys Velaryon, serving as hand. The old sea snake had survived every twist of the dance through a combination of political skill, naval power, and sheer stubbornness. But even he looked diminished now, worn down by the weight of trying to hold a shattered realm together. Cregan approached the throne and knelt, as was proper. His bannermen followed suit. The gesture was respectful, but brief. He rose almost immediately and met the young king's eyes. "Your Grace," Cregan said, his voice carrying through the hall. "I am Cregan Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. I swore an oath to your mother, Queen Rhaenyra, to support her claim to the Iron Throne. That oath now passes to you. The North stands with you." The boy king opened his mouth, closed it, and looked to Lord Corlys for guidance. The old man stepped forward. "The Crown welcomes the North's support, Lord Stark. Your arrival is most timely. There are many matters that require—" "Justice," Cregan interrupted, his tone allowing no argument. "Many matters that require justice. That's why I'm here." A ripple of unease went through the assembled lords. They had been hoping the North would arrive, help restore order, and then go home. They were beginning to realize that Cregan Stark had other plans. "Lord Corlys," Cregan continued, turning his full attention to the hand, "I would speak with you privately, and I would see the records of who held what positions during the reign of the usurper Aegon, who commanded which forces, who committed which crimes in this damned war." "Lord Stark," Corlys began carefully, "the situation is complex. Many men who served the Greens did so under duress, or have since sworn fealty to King Aegon. The realm needs healing, not more bloodshed. The realm needs justice," Cregan replied flatly. "Healing can come after. I didn't march 20,000 men south to pat traitors on the head and tell them all is forgiven." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several lords shifted uncomfortably. One, a man whose colours Cregan didn't recognise, actually took a step backward. The meeting that followed, held in the Hand's Tower, was tense and revealing. Corlys laid out the political situation with admirable honesty. The Greens had been defeated, but not destroyed. Many lords who had supported Aegon the Usurper were still alive, still held their lands, still commanded loyalty from their men. A purge would destabilize the realm further, could spark new rebellions, might undo all the work of restoring peace. Cregan listened to all of this without expression. When Corlys finished, he spoke quietly, but with absolute conviction. "Lord Corlys, I understand that you've spent the last year trying to navigate politics, trying to keep as many people alive as possible, trying to find compromises that would end the killing. I respect that. But the time for compromise is over. The dance of the dragons happened because people forgot that actions have consequences, because lords thought they could play their games without ever having to answer for them. That ends now." "You would have me execute half the lords in the realm?" Corlys asked, his voice sharp. "I would have you execute the ones who deserve it," Cregan replied. "And I would have the others understand that they live because of mercy, not because they earned it. Fear is a tool, Lord Corlys. Used properly, it prevents the next war. And used improperly, it creates one. Then we'll have to use it properly." Over the next few days, Cregan began his accounting. He demanded records, detailed records of who had served in what capacity, who had given which orders, who had committed which atrocities. The Greens had kept meticulous notes, as had the Blacks. Both sides had chronicled their enemies' crimes with loving detail, each hoping to use that information for future prosecutions. Well, now they will get their wish. What Cregan discovered sickened him. The dance had not just been a war between two factions. It had been an excuse for every petty cruelty, every sadistic impulse, every dark desire that men usually kept hidden. Rapes and murders disguised as military necessity. Torture justified as intelligence gathering. Entire villages put to the sword because they might have supported the other side. Children killed because their fathers were on the wrong list. Both sides had done it. That was the worst part. Neither the Blacks nor the Greens could claim moral superiority. Both had descended into barbarism, and both had found lords willing to commit atrocities in the name of their cause. Cregan compiled a list. It took days, cross-referencing accounts, separating confirmed crimes from rumour and propaganda. When he was done, he had 22 names, 22 lords who had committed acts so heinous that even in wartime they could not be excused or explained away. 22, Lord Corlys said when Cregan showed him the list. "You would execute 22 lords." "I would execute 22 murderers and rapists who happen to be lords," Cregan corrected. "There's a difference. The realm will not stand for this. The realm will have no choice." There was one problem, of course. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the ancient sea snake himself, was Hand of the King, and according to the law, only the Hand could order such executions without the King's direct command. And the King was 10 years old and looked ready to burst into tears every time someone spoke too loudly in his presence. Cregan could have gone around Corlys, could have pressured the boy king directly, could have used his army to simply impose his will. Instead, he did something that shocked the entire court. He demanded that Corlys resign as Hand, and that Cregan himself be appointed in his place. The request, which was really a command, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument, caused an uproar. You couldn't just demand to be Hand of the King. That wasn't how it worked. The position was appointed by the monarch, was a position of trust and counsel, required political acumen and— "I don't care about politics," Cregan interrupted the protests. "I care about justice, and justice requires authority. Make me Hand for as long as it takes to clean up this mess, and then I'll resign and go home. I don't want your power. I don't want your position. I want traitors punished, and the realm reminded that laws matter." Lord Corlys, to his eternal credit, understood what was happening. Cregan was offering him a way out. By resigning and allowing Cregan to take the Hand's position temporarily, Corlys could preserve his own reputation while still seeing justice done. The blood would be on Cregan's hands, not his, and Cregan seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. "Very well," Corlys said finally. "I will advise the king to accept your request." The young Aegon, terrified and overwhelmed, did exactly that. Cregan Stark became Hand of the King on the 3rd day after arriving in King's Landing. At 23 years old, he was the youngest man ever to hold the position, and he intended to use it in ways that would be remembered for generations. The arrests began immediately. Lords who had thought themselves safe, who had negotiated pardons or believed their crimes would be forgotten in the chaos of peace, found themselves dragged from their chambers by northern guards. No violence, no unnecessary roughness, but absolutely no mercy either. If your name was on Cregan's list, you were arrested. Rank, connections, pleading, none of it mattered. Lord Larys Strong, called the Clubfoot, who had served as Master of Whisperers to the Greens and orchestrated numerous assassinations and murders, was among the first arrested. He tried to bargain, offering information, promising betrayals, doing everything his twisted mind could conceive to save himself. Cregan listened to none of it. "You killed children," Cregan said simply. "You tortured prisoners. You burned people alive. I don't need your information. I need you dead." Sir Perkin the Flea, a commoner who had risen high during the chaos and committed numerous crimes while commanding the City Watch, was next. Then Lord Owain Borney, who had participated in the storming of Dragonstone and the subsequent massacre of servants and retainers. One by one, the names on Cregan's list were rounded up. The trials, such as they were, happened quickly. Cregan had no patience for lengthy proceedings. The evidence was presented: witness testimony, written records, confessions from other conspirators. The accused were allowed to speak in their defense. And then Cregan rendered judgment. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The executions happened in the yard of the Red Keep, not in some hidden dungeon, but in full view of the court. Cregan wanted everyone to see this, wanted them to understand that justice was being done publicly, formally, without any of the secret murders and disappearances that had characterized the dance. He didn't enjoy it. That was important. Some executioners took pleasure in their work, turning killing into spectacle or sport. Cregan approached each execution with the same cold duty he brought to everything else. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't cruelty. This was necessary, like amputating a diseased limb. Lord Larys Strong died first, beheaded by the Northern Axe. He went to his death still trying to bargain, still offering secrets, still believing that his intelligence made him indispensable. It didn't. His head rolled in the dust, and the realm became marginally cleaner. Sir Perkin the Flea tried to run. He was caught within an hour and executed that same afternoon. Cregan had no patience for cowardice. Lord Owain Borney went to his death with more dignity, accepting his fate without protest. Cregan almost respected that. Almost. By the end of the first week, 7 men were dead. The court was in shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wars ended with reconciliation, with pardons and political marriages, and everyone pretending the bloodshed had never occurred. That was how power worked in Westeros. But Cregan Stark didn't care how power usually worked. He cared about how it should work. The second week saw 8 more executions. These were harder cases, men who had committed crimes but under orders, or in the heat of battle, or under circumstances that made their guilt more ambiguous. Cregan agonized over some of these decisions. He spent hours reviewing evidence, consulting with maesters about the law, even praying to the old gods for guidance. In the end, he executed them anyway. Because ambiguity was how guilty men escaped justice. Because I was following orders was an excuse, not an absolution. Because the realm needed to know that certain lines could not be crossed, regardless of circumstances. The court began to fear him, genuinely fear him. Lords who had weathered the entire dance, who had played both sides and emerged unscathed, now walked carefully and spoke quietly, terrified that they might be next. Servants hurried through the halls, eyes down, avoiding notice. Even the guards, hardened men who had seen everything, gave Cregan a wide berth. They called it the Hour of the Wolf, though it lasted far longer than an hour. It was a time when the North ruled King's Landing, when a young lord from Winterfell held the power of life and death, and when everyone in the Red Keep learned what northern justice looked like. But Cregan wasn't a tyrant. That was the strange part, the thing that confused the southern lords. He was cold, yes, harsh, absolutely, but also scrupulously fair. If you weren't on his list, if you hadn't committed crimes serious enough to warrant execution, you were left alone. He didn't expand his purge beyond the original 22 names, didn't use his power to settle old scores or advance northern interests, didn't confiscate lands or titles beyond what was legally justified. He even protected some of the accused. When a mob formed outside the Red Keep, demanding the execution of Sir Perkin's remaining men, Cregan himself stood in their way. These men served an evil master, he told the crowd, his voice carrying over their shouts. But they are not evil themselves. They will be judged by their own actions, not his. Go home. Justice is being served, but it will be legal justice, not mob violence. The crowd, faced with 20 northern soldiers and Cregan Stark's cold fury, dispersed. There were attempts to stop him, of course. Lords who tried to use political pressure, who appealed to the young king, who sent desperate ravens to their allies in other regions. None of it worked. Cregan had the backing of the largest army in the capital, the moral authority of the North's legendary honor, and the simple fact that after a year of chaos, most people were relieved that someone, anyone, was finally imposing order. Lord Corlys watched it all, with something between horror and admiration. Late one night, as the third week of Cregan's rule drew to a close, the 2 men shared wine in the Hand Solar. "You've terrified them," Corlys said quietly. "The great lords of Westeros are afraid of a 23-year-old from Winterfell." "Good," Cregan replied. "Fear is honest. It's all the other emotions. Greed, ambition, pride, that cause problems. And when you leave, when you march your army back north and leave them to govern themselves. Then they'll remember, Cregan said. They'll remember that someone came who couldn't be bought or intimidated or seduced. They'll remember that actions have consequences, and maybe, just maybe, the next time some lord decides to start a war over a crown, he'll think twice. You really believe that? Cregan was silent for a long moment, staring into his wine cup. No, he finally admitted. Men don't learn. Not really. In 20 years, maybe less, they'll be fighting again over something equally stupid. But for now, for this moment, they'll remember. And that's worth something. By the end of the 3rd week, all 22 men on Cregan's list were dead. The executions were done. Justice, as Cregan understood it, had been served. The court expected him to continue, to expand his purge, to start executing people for lesser crimes, to use his power the way other men would, to consolidate, to entrench, to build an empire of fear. Instead, on the 21st day after becoming Hand of the King, Cregan Stark called another meeting of the court. He stood before the Iron Throne, before the young king and the assembled lords, and spoke words that shocked everyone present. My work here is done, he said simply. The traitors have been punished. The king is secure on his throne. The realm has been reminded of what justice looks like. I hereby resign as Hand of the King, effective immediately. Lord Corlys, you are restored to your position. I recommend you use it wisely. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. You're leaving? Someone finally asked. I'm going home, Cregan replied. I came to do a job. The job is finished. The North has no interest in ruling the South. We never did. We came because we swore an oath, and because someone needed to clean up the mess the dance left behind. Now it's clean. Now you can rebuild, and now I can go home to where I belong. He knelt once more before the young king. Your Grace, I wish you a long and peaceful reign. Rule justly. Remember mercy, but never forget justice. And if you ever need the North, send a raven. We keep our promises. Then he stood, turned, and walked out of the throne room. His bannermen followed, as confused as everyone else, but trusting their lord's judgment. Within hours, the northern host was preparing to march. Within days, they were gone from King's Landing, heading back up the King's Road toward home. They left behind a court still reeling from what had happened. The hour of the wolf had lasted just 3 weeks, but its impact would echo for generations. Cregan Stark had proven that power didn't corrupt everyone, that some men could hold absolute authority and then voluntarily give it up, that the North's legendary honor wasn't just propaganda, but something real and frightening in its purity. As the Northern army marched away from King's Landing as the Red, Keep shrank behind them, and the road stretched ahead. Lord Manderley rode up beside Cregan. "My lord," he said carefully, "you could have been Hand for life. You could have ruled the realm. They would have accepted it." Cregan looked at him with those cold grey eyes. "I don't want to rule the realm, Lord Manderley. I want to go home. I want to see Winterfell again. I want to walk in the Godswood and remember what honour feels like when it's not drowning in blood." He paused. "And I want them to remember that the North came, did what needed doing, and left. That's a better legacy than any crown." The march home was faster than the march south. No devastation to slow them, no uncertainty about what awaited. Just the long road back to the north, to cold stone halls and ancient trees, to a place where men still believed that some things mattered more than power. Behind them, King's Landing would slowly recover from the dance of the dragons. Lords would return to their games, plots would be hatched, ambitions would bloom again like poisonous flowers. But for a while, for a precious, brief while, they would all remember the Wolf of the North who came south and reminded them what justice looked like, and they would be afraid. The journey north was different from the march south. The army that had descended on King's Landing like winter, incarnate, now moved with something approaching relief. They had done what they came to do. Justice had been served, and now they could go home. But the realm they travelled through bore the same scars as before. The riverlands were still broken, still picking through the wreckage of a year of constant warfare. If anything, the devastation looked worse now that Cregan had time to truly observe it. On the march south, his mind had been focused on the destination, on what needed to be done in King's Landing. Now, travelling north with that burden lifted, he could see clearly what the dance had cost. It was staggering. Entire regions were depopulated. Fields that should have been planted lay fallow because there was no one left to work them. Holdfasts stood empty, their lords dead in battle or executed for their crimes, their heirs scattered or killed, their people fled or starved. The ravens that still flew carried news of famine, of disease, of communities collapsing because the social order that held them together had been shattered. Cregan ordered his army to help where they could. They left supplies at crossroads. They rebuilt bridges that had been destroyed. They even stayed a few extra days in some villages, helping to repair homes or harvest what few crops had been planted. It wasn't much. An army of 20,000 couldn't undo the damage of a year-long civil war. But it was something. And it was noticed. "You're building goodwill," Lord Manderley observed one evening as they watched northern soldiers helping villagers shore up a mill that had been partially burned. "I'm doing what's right," Cregan replied. "These people didn't start the dance. They didn't benefit from it. They just suffered through it. If we can ease that suffering even slightly, we should. The southern lords won't appreciate it. They'll see it as you overstepping your authority." "The southern lords can rot," Cregan said flatly. "I don't answer them. I answer to the gods, old and new, and I answer to my own conscience." Word of the northern army's conduct spread quickly. Small folk who had fled from previous armies, who had learned that soldiers meant rape and robbery and death, began to cautiously emerge. Some even brought food to offer. Poor food, thin gruel and hard bread, but offered freely. Cregan always accepted and always paid, even when it was clear the people had nothing. He left silver where he could, more than the food was worth, because silver might mean the difference between survival and starvation in the hard months ahead. His men grumbled sometimes about the delays, about the extra work, about helping people who weren't northerners, and therefore weren't their responsibility. Cregan heard these complaints and addressed them directly. "You think these people aren't your responsibility?" he asked one group of soldiers who had been particularly vocal. "Then tell me, when the dance started, did these small folk have a choice? Could they tell the armies to go fight somewhere else? Could they refuse to give up their food, their homes, their lives?" He paused, letting the question hang. "They couldn't. They had no more choice than you did when I called the banners. So yes, they are your responsibility. Everyone who suffers because lords play their games of power is our responsibility. Because we're the ones with swords and shields. We're the ones who decide how those weapons are used. and I'll be damned to all 7 hells before I use them only to make things worse." The grumbling stopped after that. They crossed the Trident again, paid the Freys their toll again, and continued north. The closer they got to the neck, the more the land began to change. Less devastated here, the war had barely touched the swamps and bogs that separated the north from the south. The air grew colder. The trees became evergreens instead of deciduous forests. The people they encountered spoke with northern accents, wore northern furs, worshipped the old gods at weirwood trees instead of the 7 in stone septs. Cregan felt something loosen in his chest. He was coming home. Finally, truly coming home. The passage through the neck was easier this time. The crannogmen guided them again, and the army moved with the confidence of men who knew they were almost finished with their long journey. The mood improved daily. Songs began to be heard around the evening campfires. Northern songs, old songs, songs about winter and wolves and the ancient kings who had ruled before the Targaryens came. When they finally emerged from the neck and set foot on truly northern soil, a cheer went up from the army. They had left as soldiers marching to war. They were returning as men who had done their duty and earned their rest. The march through the north was a progression of homecomings. Each lord, upon reaching his own lands, would take his leave with his men and head to his own castle. Lord Umber departed at Last Hearth, Lord Carstark at Carhold, the Glovers to Deepwood Motte. Each departure reduced the size of the host, but each was also a celebration. Men reuniting with families they hadn't seen in months, bringing news of survival and victory. Cregan watched them go with mixed feelings. These men had followed him south, had obeyed his commands, had maintained discipline even when it would have been easier to descend into the same barbarism that plagued the southern armies. They had been everything he could have asked for, and now they were going home to rebuild their own lives, to try to forget what they had seen and done. He wondered how many would succeed. War changed men. Even a relatively short, relatively clean war like this one left marks. He had seen it in his soldiers' eyes, the ones who had witnessed the devastation in the Riverlands, who had stood guard during the executions in King's Landing, who had learned that the realm they thought they knew was far darker and crueler than the songs suggested. They would carry those marks home with them, and the North would have to help them bear that weight. Finally, after weeks of travel, Winterfell appeared on the horizon. The castle looked exactly as Cregan had left it. Ancient grey walls, the smoking hot springs, the godswood with its heart tree. But somehow it seemed different. Or, perhaps, he was different. He had left as a lord, marching to war. He was returning as something else, someone who had held the power of life and death over the entire realm and then voluntarily given it up. The people of Winterfell turned out to greet him. Servants, guards, the remaining men-at-arms who had stayed to defend the castle, and small folk from Winter Town. They cheered as he rode through the gates, and Cregan allowed himself a small smile. It was good to be home. That night he held a feast in the great hall. Nothing elaborate. The North didn't believe in Southern-style excess, but enough to celebrate the return of their men and the successful completion of their mission. Lords and soldiers ate together, sharing trenches and passing ale, telling stories of what they had seen. Some stories were funny, others were grim. All of them were true, or as true as war stories ever were. Cregan listened to them all, occasionally adding a detail or correcting an exaggeration, but mostly just letting his men talk. They needed to process what they had experienced. Talking was part of that process. Late in the evening, after most of the men had either gone to their beds or were too drunk to make sense, Lord Manderley approached Cregan at the high table. "A word, my lord?" Manderley asked. They stepped out into the corridor, away from the noise and warmth of the hall. The stone walls of Winterfell were cold, but Cregan welcomed it. The cold was honest, real, unlike the political heat of King's Landing. "What troubles you, Lord Manderley?" Cregan asked. "Nothing troubles me, my lord. Or rather, everything does. But that's not why I wanted to speak." Manderley paused, choosing his words carefully. "You did something remarkable in King's Landing, something that will be remembered for generations. You held power that most men would kill for, and you walked away from it. You terrified the most powerful lords in Westeros, and then you left them alone. I wanted to understand why." Cregan was silent for a long moment, staring at a torch flickering in its sconce. "Have you ever held a sword, Lord Manderley? Really held one, used one in battle?" "I have, my lord, in my younger days." "Then you know that a sword is just a tool. It has no morality of its own. It's neither good nor evil. It simply is." Cregan turned to face the older man. "Power is the same way. It's a tool. And like any tool, it's only as good or evil as the person wielding it. The problem is that most men forget that. They start thinking that power is something to accumulate, to hoard, to cling to. They forget it's meant to be used for a purpose, and then set aside when that purpose is accomplished." "And your purpose was justice," Manderley said. "My purpose was to remind the realm that justice exists. Those laws matter. That you can't just do whatever you want because you have dragons or gold or armies." Cregan looked back at the torch. The dance happened because people forgot that. Because the Targaryens thought they were above the law. Because lords thought their ambitions mattered more than the people they ruled. Someone needed to show them they were wrong. That's all I did. And now I rule the North as I was meant to. I serve my people as I was raised to do. I try to be just and fair and remember that every decision I make affects real lives." He smiled slightly. "It's harder than being Hand of the King, actually. At least in King's Landing, the answers were clear. Here, everything is complicated." Manderley laughed at that. "My lord, you're wiser than your years suggest." "I'm tired, Lord Manderley. That's what I am. Tired of blood and politics and war. I want to rebuild. I want to help the North recover from what we've been through. I want to—" He trailed off. "Want what, my lord?" "I want to be more than the wolf who went south and executed traitors," Cregan said quietly. "That's what they'll remember me for. That's what the histories will say. But I want to be more than that. I want to be a lord who built things, who helped his people, who left the North stronger than he found it." "You will be, my lord," Manderley said with conviction. "The executions were necessary, but they were just 3 weeks of your life. You have decades ahead to build the legacy you want." Cregan hoped he was right. The weeks following his return were consumed with the business of governance. War was expensive, even a war the North had barely participated in. Taxes needed to be adjusted, loans needed to be negotiated, trade agreements needed to be restored. The neck needed repairs, bridges washed out, causeways damaged. Winter was coming, as it always did, and the North needed to be prepared. Cregan threw himself into this work with the same intensity he had brought to everything else. He met with his bannermen, discussed agricultural yields, reviewed reports from the Night's Watch about wildling activity beyond the wall. It was tedious, unglamorous work, the kind that never made it into songs or stories. But it was important. It was how you kept people alive. He also spent time in the Godswood, as he always had. The heart tree with its carved face seemed to watch him with ancient understanding. Cregan would kneel in the dirt and snow, hands pressed against the white bark, and try to make sense of everything that had happened. He had killed 22 men, 22 human beings, each with their own stories, their own families, their own justifications for what they had done. And he had ended them, as coldly and efficiently as a farmer slaughtering pigs for winter. Was that right? Had it been just? The old gods gave no answer. They never did. But Cregan found a kind of peace in the silence. He had done what he believed was necessary, had acted according to his principles, even when it was hard. That was all any man could do. The rest was between him and whatever gods might exist. Winter came to Winterfell, as it always did. The first real snows fell, blanketing the castle and the surrounding lands in white. The hot springs kept the inner yards clear, but beyond the walls, the world turned into a frozen landscape of startling beauty and deadly cold. Cregan stood at his window one morning, watching the snowfall, and thought about the boy king in King's Landing, Aegon III, who would come to be called Aegon the Dragonbane, though all he had done was survive while dragons killed each other. What kind of man would he grow to be? Would he remember the lessons of the dance? Would he rule justly, or would he become just another Targaryen tyrant, convinced of his own divine right? There was no way to know. Cregan had done what he could, provided an example, shown what justice looked like, then stepped aside to let others build on that foundation. The rest was up to the young king and the lords who advised him. A raven arrived one day from King's Landing. Cregan read it in his solar, alone. It was from Lord Corlys Velaryon, writing in his capacity as Hand of the King. The letter was formal, thanking the North for its service, assuring Cregan that the king held him in high regard, and updating him on the political situation. The realm was stabilizing. Slowly, painfully, but stabilizing. Lords were returning to their seats, rebuilding their castles, replanting their fields. The fear that Cregan had instilled was working. People were behaving, following the law, avoiding the kind of predatory behavior that had characterized the dance. It wouldn't last forever. Corlys knew that, and Cregan knew he knew it. But for now, for this moment, there was something approaching peace. The letter ended with a personal note. You asked me once if I thought men could learn from history. I told you they couldn't. I'm not sure I've changed my mind, but I think you've taught them something nonetheless. You've taught them fear, not the cruel fear of a tyrant, but the healthy fear of consequences. That's worth something. Perhaps it's worth everything. Cregan folded the letter carefully and placed it in a locked chest where he kept important documents. Then he returned to the work of governing the North. Life settled into a rhythm. Spring came eventually, melting the snow and bringing new growth. Cregan remarried, a northern girl from House Dustin, sturdy and practical, who understood that being Lady of Winterfell meant hard work, not courtly games. She gave him children, strong sons and fierce daughters who grew up hearing stories about their father's march south. But Cregan never talked about King's Landing with his children. When they asked about the dance of the dragons, about the hour of the wolf, about what it had been like to hold the power of life and death, he would simply say, "I did what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less." His bannermen understood his reticence. The men who had marched south with him rarely spoke of it either. There was an unspoken agreement among them. What had happened in King's Landing stayed in King's Landing. They had witnessed something, participated in something that was too dark and too necessary to be treated as entertainment or glory. Years passed. The North prospered under Cregan's rule. He proved to be exactly the kind of lord his people needed. Just, firm, willing to make hard decisions, but never cruel. He settled disputes, managed resources, prepared for winters, and maintained the ancient traditions that made the North unique. He never went south again. There was no need. The realm managed its own affairs, and the North was content to remain separate, participating in the larger politics of Westeros only when absolutely necessary. That was how it should be, Cregan believed. The North was not the South's servant. It was a partner, and partners maintained their own identity, their own pride, their own way of doing things. Occasionally, ravens would arrive with news from King's Landing. King Aegon had grown into a somber, cautious ruler, scarred by his childhood trauma, but determined to be better than the relatives who had torn the realm apart fighting over him. He never forgot the lesson of Cregan Stark, that power had limits, that justice mattered, that some men couldn't be bought or intimidated. Other lords, predictably, did forget. There were rebellions, plots, small conflicts that flared and died, but nothing approaching the scale of the dance. The realm had been burned too badly to risk that again, at least for a generation or two. Cregan watched these developments with the detachment of someone who had done his part and moved on. He hoped the realm would learn. He suspected it wouldn't. Not permanently. But that was no longer his problem. He had his own people to worry about, his own land to tend. Late in his life, when his hair had turned grey and his beard had grown long, a young maester asked him about the hour of the wolf. The boy was writing a history, trying to understand what had motivated Cregan to do what he did. "What made you walk away from power?" the maester asked. "You could have ruled the 7 kingdoms. You could have been more powerful than any hand in history. Why give it up?" Cregan, old now but still sharp-eyed, considered the question seriously. "Because I'm a Stark," he said finally. And Starks understand something that Southern lords often forget. Power is a burden, not a prize. It's something you carry for a time, used to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, and then set down. Only a fool tries to hold on to it forever. "But surely—" "No," Cregan interrupted gently. "There's no but, surely. That's the whole lesson. Power corrupts most men because they see it as something to possess. I saw it as something to use, and once I'd used it for its intended purpose, I had no more need of it." He paused. "Besides, I wanted to come home. This is where I belong. Not in some southern castle, playing politics with lords who think honor is a weakness. Here, in the North, where men still believe in something beyond their own ambition." The Maester wrote this down carefully, preserving it for future generations. When Cregan Stark finally died, many years after his march south, the North mourned. He had been their lord for decades, had guided them through difficult times, had maintained their traditions and their pride. His funeral was held in the Godswood, before the Heart Tree, with northern lords and common folk alike coming to pay respects. They buried him in the crypts beneath Winterfell, as all lords of Winterfell were buried. His stone likeness was carved with care, a stern face, cold eyes, a direwolf at his feet, and an iron sword across his lap. The inscription was simple: Cregan Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, he kept faith. And in King's Landing, when word of his death arrived, the court held a moment of silence. Old men who had been young when Cregan marched south told stories to those who had never met him. They spoke of his justice, his honour, his terrifying certainty. They spoke of the hour of the wolf, when winter came south and reminded them all what it meant to face someone who couldn't be corrupted, could not be swayed, could not be stopped. He was the last of a breed, one old lord said, shaking his head. Men like that don't exist anymore. But up in the north, in the cold stone halls of Winterfell, Cregan's children and grandchildren would have disagreed. The north bred men like Cregan Stark in every generation. Men who understood duty, who valued honour over ambition, who would do what needed to be done and then go home. They were called Starks. And they were still there, still watching, still remembering, because winter was always coming, and someone needed to be ready for it. The years that followed Cregan Stark's return to Winterfell would prove him right about one thing. The realm didn't learn its lessons permanently. Within a generation, new conflicts would arise, new ambitious lords would scheme, new wars would threaten to tear Westeros apart. But for a time, for one precious span of peace, the memory of the hour of the wolf kept men honest, or, at least, kept them cautious. Cregan ruled the north for another 47 years after his return from King's Landing. It was a long reign, longer than most, and it transformed both the man and the region he governed. The young lord who had marched south at 23 became an elder statesman, a living legend, a figure whose very name carried weight across the 7 kingdoms. But he never became soft. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about Cregan Stark's long life. He maintained the same iron principles that had driven him south, the same unwavering commitment to justice, from his youth until his death. Lesser men might have mellowed with age, might have learned to compromise, to bend, to make peace with the comfortable corruptions that age and power brought. Cregan never did. There were moments that tested him, of course. Every long reign has its challenges. In the 5th year after his return, a coalition of minor northern lords attempted to challenge his authority, claiming that he had overstepped his bounds in King's Landing, that his actions had brought unwanted southern attention to the north. They demanded a council to discuss limiting the powers of the Lord of Winterfell. Cregan met with them. He listened to their grievances, and then he spoke. "You're right," he said, and the shock on their faces was almost comical. "I did bring southern attention to the north. I made us visible in a way we haven't been since the conquest. And you're also right that I overstepped traditional bounds. I did things as Hand of the King that no northern lord had ever done before." He paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what you're wrong about. You think that was a mistake. You think we should hide in our cold castles and let the South manage its own affairs. And I'm telling you that we tried that. For 100 years after Torrhen Stark bent the knee, we tried that. We stayed quiet, stayed out of things, let the Targaryens do whatever they wanted. And what did that get us?" He stood, his presence filling the hall. It got us the dance of the dragons. It got us a realm torn apart because no one was willing to stand up and say, enough. It got us dead dragons and devastated lands and a generation of trauma that the South still hasn't recovered from. So yes, I went south. Yes, I executed traitors and terrified lords and made the North impossible to ignore, because the alternative was letting them destroy themselves and us along with them. The challenge dissolved after that. The lords returned to their keeps, grumbling perhaps, but understanding. Cregan had a way of making you understand things, even when you didn't want to. He was careful, though, not to expand his authority beyond what was necessary. He ruled the North, but he didn't dominate it. He allowed his bannermen their autonomy, their own ways of managing their lands. He understood that the North was strong precisely because it was diverse. Different houses with different traditions, all bound together by common values and mutual respect. That respect was earned through actions, not demanded through fear. When House Hornwood faced a succession crisis, Cregan mediated personally, spending weeks travelling between keeps and meeting with claimants. His solution was both practical and just, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but left everyone better off than they would have been through war. When famine struck the mountain clans in the high valleys, Cregan opened Winterfell stores without hesitation. He sent food north, along with builders to help strengthen the clan's defences against wildling raids. Some of his advisors questioned the expense. The mountain clans were proud, insular, and often troublesome. Why waste resources on them? Because they're northerners, Cregan replied simply. They bend the knee to Winterfell. That means Winterfell protects them. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. His marriage to Lenara Dustin proved to be a solid partnership. She was not a romantic figure. The North rarely produced those. But she was intelligent, capable, and shared Cregan's practical view of governance. She managed Winterfell's household with the same efficiency Cregan brought to managing the North. Together, they raised 5 children who survived to adulthood, 3 sons and 2 daughters, each taught the Stark values of duty, honour, and service. The eldest, Rickon, would inherit Winterfell. Cregan trained him personally, much as his own father had trained him. He took the boy into the crypts, showed him the faces of dead Starks, explained the weight of history and responsibility. He taught him to fight, not for glory, but for survival. He taught him to judge men fairly, to listen before deciding, to value wisdom over cleverness. The North doesn't need brilliant lords, Cregan told his son. It needs just one. It needs men who will do the hard thing, even when the easy thing is right there. Can you be that man? Rickon, to his credit, understood the question. I'll try, father. That's all anyone can ask. The second son, Brandon, was more martial. He took service with the Night's Watch, eventually becoming First Ranger. The third, Jonel, married into House Manderley and helped strengthen ties between Winterfell and White Harbour. The daughters married into Houses Karstark and Glover, respectively, binding the North's great houses together through blood and alliance. Cregan watched his children grow and felt something he had rarely allowed himself: satisfaction. He had built something here, not just in his own legacy, but in the generation he was preparing to take over. These children understood what the North was, what it meant, what it required. They would continue the work after he was gone. But the realm did not forget him, even as he aged. Ravens came regularly from King's Landing, from lords seeking his advice, from monarchs wanting his support. King Aegon III wrote to him several times, thanking him for his service, asking his opinion on various matters of governance. Cregan always replied, though his letters grew shorter as he aged. He had said what needed to be said in King's Landing. Anything else was just repetition. The histories were being written about the dance of the dragons. Masters throughout the realm compiled accounts, interviewed survivors, and tried to make sense of the catastrophe that had nearly destroyed Westeros. And in every account, the Hour of the Wolf featured prominently. Some histories praised Cregan without reservation, calling him the saviour of the realm, the man who had restored justice when all seemed lost. Others were more critical, questioning his right to execute lords without a proper trial, suggesting his actions were motivated by ambition disguised as honour. A few even accused him of using justice as cover for northern supremacy, for imposing his will on a south too weak to resist. Cregan read these histories with wry amusement. "They're all wrong," he told his Maester, "and they're all right. That's the problem with history. It's never as simple as the historians want it to be." "How would you describe what you did, my lord?" the Master asked. "I did what needed to be done," Cregan replied. "No more, no less. Everything else is interpretation." But the interpretations mattered because they shaped how future generations understood the dance. And increasingly, as the years passed and memory faded, Cregan Stark became less a real person and more a symbol. He was the embodiment of northern justice, cold, harsh, but ultimately fair. He was the lord who couldn't be corrupted, the man who held absolute power and gave it up, the wolf who came south and reminded the realm that honour still existed. It was a heavy legacy to bear. Cregan felt its weight growing heavier as he aged. Young lords would visit Winterfell specifically to meet him, to see the legend in person. They were often disappointed. He was just a man, after all, grey and worn, with aching joints and failing eyes. The stories had built him into something more than human. The reality was inevitably less impressive. "You're not what I expected," one young lord from the Stormlands said during a visit. "What did you expect?" Cregan asked. "Someone bigger, fiercer. The stories make you sound like you were 7 feet tall and breathed ice." Cregan laughed at that. "I'm 6 feet, and I breathe the same air as everyone else. The stories are just stories. What I did wasn't magical or impossible. It was just necessary, and anyone with the will to do it could have done the same." "But they didn't," the young lord pointed out. "You did." "Yes," Cregan acknowledged, "I did, and I paid the price for it." "What price? You're honoured throughout the realm. Your name is legend." "The price," Cregan said quietly, "is that I can still see their faces. Every man I executed. Every order I gave that sent men to their deaths. Every hard choice that brought peace with blood. That's the price of justice. You carry it with you forever. The stories don't mention that part." The young lord had no response to that. As Cregan entered his 60s, he began to consider succession more seriously. Rickon was ready, had been ready for years, actually. But Cregan was reluctant to step aside, not because he wanted to cling to power, but because he felt responsible. He had shaped the North into what it was. He wanted to see that work completed, or at least secured. "You need to let go," Lenara told him one night. They were in their chambers, the fire burning low, the castle quiet around them. "Rickon is capable. You've trained him well, and you're not immortal, no matter what the songs say." "I know," Cregan replied. "But what if something goes wrong? What if—" "Then he'll handle it," Lenara interrupted. "The same way you handled things when your father died, and you were even younger than Rickon is now. You have to trust that he learned from you. Trust that the North will endure." She was right, of course. She usually was. Cregan began delegating more responsibilities to Rickon, letting him handle increasingly complex matters of governance. His son proved more than capable. He had inherited Cregan's sense of justice, but tempered it with more flexibility, more willingness to find creative solutions. He would be a good lord, perhaps a better one than Cregan had been. The realm changed around them as the years passed. King Aegon III died, succeeded by his son Daeron. The young king proved to be ambitious and capable, successfully conquering Dorne and finally bringing the last independent kingdom into the Seven Kingdoms. It was the kind of military triumph that would have been impossible during the chaos following the dance. The realm had healed enough to project power again. Cregan watched this development with mixed feelings. On one hand, stability was good. A strong realm was better than a weak one. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that men were already forgetting the lessons of the dance. Already convinced that dragons and ambition could solve problems that required wisdom and restraint. "They'll have another war eventually," he told Lord Manderley during one of the Old Lord's final visits to Winterfell. Both men were ancient now, survivors of an age that was rapidly fading. Maybe not in our lifetimes, or our children's, but eventually some Targaryen will decide that violence is easier than governance, and will do this all over again. "Then let's hope there's another Stark willing to march south and remind them otherwise," Manderley replied. "There will be," Cregan said with certainty. "The North breeds men like us in every generation. It's who we are. It's what the land makes us. When the next crisis comes, whoever rules Winterfell will do what needs to be done. You've made sure of that, haven't you? That's what all this has been about. Not just handling the dance, but setting an example for future Starks." "Someone had to," Cregan said simply. In his 70th year, Cregan Stark finally laid down the formal duties of Lord of Winterfell. He didn't die. He had a few more years in him yet. But he recognized that age had caught up with him, that his mind was still sharp, but his body was failing, and that Rickon deserved the chance to rule in his own right, not just as a regent for an aging father. The ceremony was simple, as befitted northern traditions. In the great hall of Winterfell, before the assembled lords and ladies of the North, Cregan formally passed the ancient Valyrian greatsword Ice to his son. "This sword has been wielded by Starks for 400 years, Cregan said, his voice still strong, despite his age. "It has defended the North. It has executed traitors. It has symbolized everything our house stands for: strength, justice, the willingness to do what must be done. Now it passes to you, Rickon. Wield it, as I have tried to wield it, wisely, justly, and only when necessary. Remember that power is a burden, not a prize, and remember that the North watches, always." Rickon took the sword with steady hands. "I will remember, Father, and I will try to be worthy of what you've built." "You already are," Cregan said. He stepped down from the high seat, and his son took his place. The transfer was complete. Cregan Stark was no longer Lord of Winterfell. He was just Cregan. An old man with memories and scars, with stories he rarely told, and wisdom he was still willing to share when asked. He spent his final years in relative peace. He walked in the godswood daily, regardless of weather, speaking silently to the old gods and finding comfort in the ancient trees. He played with his grandchildren, teaching them the lessons he had taught his own children. He corresponded with old friends and allies, comparing ailments and complaining about young people, the way old men always did. And sometimes, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he would descend into the crypts. He would walk among the statues of his ancestors, past all those stone Starks who had ruled before him, and he would think about legacy. What had he accomplished? What would endure? The hour of the wolf would be remembered, certainly. The histories would preserve that. But would they understand it? Would future generations grasp that it wasn't about power or glory, but about duty, about the simple conviction that some things, justice, honor, the rule of law, mattered more than personal advantage? He didn't know, couldn't know. That was the burden of every lord, every leader, every person who tried to make the world slightly better than they found it. You did your work, set your example, and hoped it mattered. The rest was beyond your control. Cregan Stark died in his sleep during the winter of his 73rd year. He went to bed one night, telling his wife he was tired, and simply didn't wake up. It was a gentle death, far gentler than he probably deserved, given the violence he had witnessed and inflicted. But the gods, whether old or new, had granted him that mercy. The North mourned. Every house sent representatives to Winterfell for the funeral. Lord Rickon led the ceremony in the godswood, where the heart tree watched with its carved face as they said their goodbyes. The words were simple, as Cregan would have wanted. He had been their lord. He had served them well. He had kept faith. That was enough. They laid him in the crypts with his ancestors, carving his likeness in stone. The sculptor captured him as he had been in his prime, stern but not cruel, strong but not brutal, a man who understood the weight of responsibility. At his feet was a direwolf. Across his lap was an iron sword, smaller than the actual ice, but symbolically the same. And on the plaque beside his statue were the words he had chosen years earlier. He kept faith. News of his death spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms. In King's Landing, King Daeron I ordered 3 days of mourning for the man who had saved his grandfather's throne. Lords throughout the realm sent condolences, shared stories, and reflected on what Cregan Stark had meant. The histories would debate his legacy for generations. Some would see him as a hero, the incorruptible lord who restored justice. Others would view him more critically, the harsh Northman who imposed his will on a weakened realm. Still others would try to find nuance, to understand the complexity of a man who could be both merciful and merciless, both humble and proud, both dutiful and ambitious. But in the North there was no debate. They knew what Cregan Stark had been. He was their lord. He was their example. He was the reminder that the old ways, the ways of honor and duty and keeping faith, still mattered in a world that increasingly seemed to value only power and gold. And they knew that when the next crisis came, when the realm descended once more into chaos and needed someone to stand firm and refuse to bend, there would be another Stark at Winterfell. Another lord willing to do what Cregan had done. Bear the burden, make the hard choices, and pay the price that justice demanded. Because that was what it meant to be a Stark. To endure, to remember, to keep faith with the old ways even when the world changes around you. To understand that some things, honor, justice, duty, were not negotiable. They were the foundation upon which everything else was built. Lose them, and you lose everything. Cregan Stark understood that. He lived it, and in living it, he ensured that the North would never forget. The wolf had gone home, the legend endured, and winter, as it always did, was still coming. Cregan Stark held absolute power and walked away after 3 weeks. He proved that some men can't be corrupted, can't be bought, and can't be stopped. What do you think? Hero or tyrant? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the legends and mysteries of Westeros, hit that subscribe button. There's always more to uncover in the world of ice and fire. Winter is coming.